Mosberger. David is probably the first person outside of Linus or outside of digital to have purchased an alpha system with the express intent of running Linux. And indeed, I believe he may have predated our own efforts on it. David is a resident, or at least a native of Switzerland, and currently a resident of the warm, sunny Tucson, Arizona area. He's currently enrolled in a PhD program. He's studying computer science and networking, and he's using his degree program as an excuse to work on Alpha Linux, and I suspect using Alpha Linux as an excuse to continue his degree program. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce David to Digital today.
Okay, it works now, I think. Okay, I should probably mention that while I do enjoy hacking and all that stuff, the reason why I'm probably here is because I'm noisy. I'm all over the news groups. If you read ComSysTech or the Linux alpha mailing lists, I really try to convince people that Linux and alpha are great things individually, and together they're even better. And what I would like to talk about is that the title of my slide says the sum of alpha, Linux, and academia provides great opportunities, not just for academia itself, but actually for digital, I hope. But I think actually a better title would have been Don't Be Afraid of Linux. I think that's really the message that I try to convey. Linux is a great opportunity for digital to get really into the market, I believe. And especially so because Linux will not cost digital almost anything. You can get into the market that way with very little expense. And I'll get to that a little bit later, what I believe what digital could do to help the Linux community get it better working on the alpha. I also should like to mention that this talk was actually prepared on a 275 megahertz CV4 alpha PC that was sponsored by I guess the Alpha Migration Tool Group and Mad Dog. And everything was done with free software, actually, so no PowerPoint or anything. I apologize that there's no color, but my printer happened to run out of color. Let's put it nicely. The other thing I should mention is that I'm affiliated with the University of Arizona, but most of the work was done on my own. However, I couldn't have gotten started without having alphas around in my department, so that really helped. So Linux in academia, why do I think this is a great thing? Well, first of all, we noticed that Linux already is rising in popularity. For example, Symposium on Operating System Principle, which is one thing that I happen to know. In 1993, I believe there was not a single paper. That's actually from memory. I didn't go back and actually count. In 1995, there were 2 papers presented that had research based on Linux on it. Now, that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but first of all, SOSP is really a very highly competitive conference, and it's really the top. And in the whole conference, there were 20 papers, so this is like 10%. So it's very significant, actually. And Linux is being talked about in academia a lot these days. Another thing is, like in our department, in 1994, maybe 1 or 2 Linux machines, and those were mostly because people happened to use them at home and they brought them into the department. In 1995, we had at least 10 Linux machines. 4 of them were DCG machines with Linux on alphas. In 1997, we are going to have on the order of 80 Linux machines for a cluster that we are going to build. The only question there is it's either going to be a P6-based cluster or some alpha-based cluster. I hope it's clear what I'm hoping for, but there's other people that need to be convinced, and it depends a little bit on what digital is doing. whether we're going to have 64 Linux Alpha machines or x86 machines. Why do I believe popularity is increasing? Well, actually, I'm a little bit, to be perfectly honest, the primary reason why this is so has nothing to do with Linux. It's primarily because the x86 caught up performance-wise. Research is by its nature, I believe, pretty much opportunistic, and people have to use what they can get. And x86s are cheap, and by now they are pretty decent performance-wise. In my particular field, the Alpha is still a lot more interesting just because of the architecture and the outlooks of what it could be in the future. So the x86 just is abundant, so people start to use them for their research as well. The other reason is that Linux is no longer limited to the x86. So the Alpha, which I think makes a great research machine, is available there now, so we can have it there too. Another reason why it's very popular is that in academia it works very much like that students, they need a system for home. They might not like DOS or Windows or whatever. They install Linux, they see it works. It looks almost exactly the same as what they're used to in academia. They can use the same programs, they can do their homework at home. They can even do OS research with Linux because the kernel is there, it's easy to understand, you get all the sources. It's a great opportunity to learn about operating systems that way. In the university, there's not that often that you can find a machine that a student is allowed to reboot. With Linux at home, they can do that as much as they want to. Furthermore, I alluded to before already that Unix is still very dominant in academia, and I don't know, I don't think it's going to change that quickly. I may be wrong on that, but even so, there's going to be some time before that would happen. And as long as that is the case, then Linux is really a nice opportunity to allow people to do the same thing at home. Furthermore, Linux is free. It comes with all the tools that academic environment needs. In particular, that's still LaTeX, Emacs, GNU-C, TCP/IP. It comes with NFS. Almost anything that you can imagine you can do, even play games for that matter. One thing that's particularly important for OS research, and actually not just OS research, a lot of the research is that source code availability is important because we need to make changes to the kernel and add extensions and so on. And in our case, it was that in 1993 we had the first alphas running OSF1. And so in 1994 we got to the point where we decided we really need the kernel sources to make progress. So we started to pursue that, and fortunately, because we had some collaboration with OSF1, we didn't have to pay for it. But anyhow, we started to pursue that. It started to look good. 1995, I started to work on porting Linux to a no-name board. And in 1996, actually it was like December 95, we finally had the OSF1 sources available. And well, at the same point, we got 4 alpha shipped with Linux installed. So at the same time that it took us to obtain the licenses and all for OSF1, we actually managed to port Linux to the alpha and make it into a decent system. So that just shows a little bit how the dynamics works in an academic environment. I should also like to mention here that don't be afraid. I actually hate to look at the OSF1 sources because I don't want to mix Linux development and OSF1 sources. So in particular, there was one project where I really had to do on OSF1 because as Linus alluded to before, networking is still a little bit lacking in Linux. But I tried to stay away from the OSF1 sources to avoid contamination, so to speak. So now we have OSF1, Windows NT that everybody talks about, so where goes Linux? First of all, I think it's important to realize that the choice is not really between Linux Alpha versus OSF1. I think it's Linux Alpha versus Windows NT. OSF1 targets a very different market, in my opinion, and I don't think it will happen very often that there will be a choice between DEC, Unix, and Linux Alpha. I'm sorry, I still use OSF1 because it's simply shorter to type. So Linux versus Windows NT. Well, I think digital is doing the right thing. I think Windows NT has a good chance of becoming a strong force in the market. However, just because that will cover 90% of the market doesn't mean that you should ignore the remaining 10% that may prefer to run Linux. In particular, if getting those extra 10% doesn't cost you anything or very little, then why should you ignore those 10%? That doesn't make any sense. Please don't put off people just because you're pushing Windows NT. Nobody objects to Windows NT. I think it's a great system and it's appropriate for some people, but not for everybody. So please let us have a choice. I think that's all it's about.
David,
Mm-hmm.
I might also say that in a lot of cases, selling people Linux Alpha has actually sold digital Unix as servers.
Oh, yeah, that's actually an interesting point. Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, what you should be after is just selling as many Alpha boxes as possible, and I think Linux can help doing that. And especially, I'd like to emphasize that make it known to the world what the Alpha looks like, because once you know the Alpha, it's very hard not to fall in love with it. It's a very elegant architecture, and it's if you read Hennessy Patterson and carry it out to the logical conclusion, you are pretty close to the Alpha, and I think it has a lot of future. So, which I'm not sure is the case for other currently popular processors. Now you might wonder. So we have on the one hand digital, which I believe is still a multi-million-dollar company, and actually turning in profit, I hear. So I'm optimistic. So how does this work together with something that's more like that's grassroots, like Linux? Initially, I was actually really a little bit concerned because I was afraid that here come the digital guys and they just control everything. They want to say, we do this, and no, we don't want to do that. But it turned out that at least the experience so far was really excellent. People in, I guess, the Alpha Migration Tool Group and Dave Rosling, they were excellent people to collaborate with. It's interesting how much they contributed and how little credit they take, and I find that pretty amazing. So I don't think there's any problems so far, and I don't expect any problems in the future. The spirit of Linux Alpha is still very much grassroots, and I think it has caused some problems occasionally, but I think overall it's a huge success, especially if you consider that we basically managed to get Linux from the point of non-existence to a Red Hat distribution within roughly a year. I think that alone speaks for itself. Actually, one thing I would like to point out that often it was the case that it seemed like the DEC people tried to stay back from the front or so, and it was actually then other people outside of DEC that were hoping for more leadership from DEC, which is kind of ironic. But I think it's still the right thing. Grassroots has a lot of virtue in this environment. So a little bit, what's the current status? Functionality-wise, I think Linux Alpha is complete. It's definitely good enough for all the daily work that I do, which is probably not that typical. I don't think we have any. I don't have any DOS programs that I rely on or so. So what I'm doing is like kernel hacking. I do mail, editing, typesetting, news reading, occasional web surfing, and also a game once or twice. Reliability, I haven't had any problems. I haven't lost the file system since I started working on Linux Alpha. And the 12 days may not look very impressive, but the problem is I never ever get to run my machine for longer because Linux turns out kernels that fast. So I have to reboot because there's a new kernel, not because it crashes. And just to illustrate that the system that I run at home is actually not trivial. The setup that we have is we have an older 486. It's a Cyrix, I should mention. Then there is this no-name that I bought with my own money. It's alive and working great. I built this for actually around $2,000. So I proved a lot of colleagues of mine wrong by being able to put together an alpha box for $2,000. Now I wish that no-name would perform a little bit better. Price performance-wise, it's still not very good. But if you just really need to have an alpha for your work, which was the case for me, then it's entirely possible to do it. And the main machine is the Loner, a 275 megahertz cabriolet-based machine, which I'm very happy with, I must say. This machine is connected via a PPP link to my ISP. And locally we run Ethernet to connect the other two machines. And as you see here, these are actually fake IP numbers. So what we do here on this machine is we run Socket Daemon, which is sort of a gateway between the two networks. So this allows us to run Netscape on this machine, for example, and have it access the internet directly through proxy. And this works really beautifully. So I think it's definitely a usable system for many people already, especially if you're coming from a Unix environment. You will feel right at home. There certainly are quite a few bugs left, at least in the applications. I think the kernel is doing very well, actually. But as we go along, we will keep fixing those problems. Could just take a little bit of time. Oh, the other thing that I found amazing is the gateway here is actually, the link there is a 288K modem that I bought for like $99. I plugged it into the ISA slot, and I use all the standard Linux drivers. So just being able to go out into the shop and buy the cheap external peripherals for the alpha boxes, that helps tremendously already. Actually, Mad Dog also sent me a Sound Blaster 16, which is doing great. So I think that was really an excellent design decision to make the alpha hardware PC compatible in terms of peripherals. Significant or interesting or important future projects, I would like to say that they are works in progress, but some of them are actually. In particular this one, NFS in an academic environment. One thing that I noticed that makes it difficult to put Linux into an academic environment right now is that NFS performance is still lacking quite a bit, and Linus is working on that, so I'm convinced fairly soon this will be fixed. But in our environment, we have so many machines and everybody's moving around. We depend almost 100% on accessing all our files via NFS, so it's essential. Shared library support, please make that ELF standard as fast as you can. Linux is very dynamic, and we depend on having an ELF standard, and as Linus said, it would be nice if it could be compatible with whatever OSF1 or DEC Unix will use. Then there's some other minor projects that I don't want to bother you with. The other major thing is that we probably should have some sort of x86 compatibility, maybe DOS, porting DOS emu, and some kind of Windows emulator, maybe Wine-based, or maybe the Willow software looks pretty interesting too. We need a lot more X-free servers. Right now that's pretty limited, and in particular more languages and good compilers. I'd like to emphasize that. And then finally, I would really love to have a Netscape binary for my alpha. And it's so sad because all they would have to do is compile it statically under OSF1, and there we would go. But it didn't happen so far. We have Mosaic by now, so Motif is up and running actually. So now my 2 cents, what digital can do, you can take it or leave it, obviously. If I had the chance to give this talk a year ago, I would have done it that way. And right now I'm actually afraid I will have to put this into past tense. Digital was really doing great in 1993, 1994, they had 2 machines on the internet which were accessible to everybody. They provided a free sample instruction scheduler for the EV4. And all those things just contribute to make it very attractive for research. We depend on having such things available because we cannot afford to rewrite everything from scratch, in particular when it comes to machine details, which we usually could get only under non-disclosure after years of negotiation. So please, if somebody is in here that has the powers to change that, make available an EV5 sample scheduler. It doesn't have to be a fast one, just one that shows how it works internally, and that's good enough to get some CPI measurements and so on. That would be really lovely. So I would encourage, I feel a little bit that since the alphas have become more successful, basically the openness decreased proportionally, and I'm afraid that's going to continue, and that would have the potential of kill the success that they have enjoyed so far. So I think it's important to be open, to give people access to documentation, to encourage people to study the alpha, because it's a nice machine. There's nothing to be ashamed of, I think. So go ahead, make manuals available. Also, actually, a lot of people are doing a great job answering questions on the internet, like ComSysDeck, and I think that's really a great thing to do. Because, well, you might say, well, we are just students, but in a couple of years, we might sit in an important chair, and it's good to have friends then. One thing that I'm still missing is the architecture reference manual. I have a PostScript file at home, but I don't have the permission to make it available via FTP. And if you look around, actually, pretty much any other CPU, you can get the reference manual online. Now, I understand there are some contractual problems with that, so that might not happen, but at least for the hackerish systems like the Cabriolet or No Name or so, make available the documentation online. I have PostScript file for the Cabriolet and everything, but I'm still waiting for the go-ahead to make it available online. And also I should point out that just because you make a manual available online doesn't mean that you're not going to sell any hard copies anymore. I think the opposite is the case, because usually an online manual you use to browse through it, maybe as a reference or so, but if you really want to get a good handle on what's going on, you need to print a copy. So I think it will actually help you sell printed copies. Another thing I would like to see is that Digital is starting to think about offering layered products licenses for Linux. Is anybody here doing layered products like compilers or so? Too bad. You may say this is too difficult and too much of a hassle, but compiling something for Linux, once it's working on digital Unix, is really very straightforward. So I think with almost no overhead, it would be possible to provide, for example, an excellent Fortran compiler. Also, the gem compilers are excellent tools. And a lot of people will be willing to pay for that, even if they use a Linux system, because maybe they don't need DEC OSF1 because most of the time they're perfectly happy with Linux. But a lot of people like to do like floating point intensive stuff, which requires a good Fortran compiler. And right now, Linux, there is GNU Fortran, but I hear that it's not doing too well. And people will be happy to spend some money on that. So why not sell this stuff? So I don't know, that's pretty much what I have to say for now. If you're more interested in seeing what's going on currently with Linux Alpha, here's some addresses that might be of interest. The web page is not very interesting, but the FAQ I would suggest for everybody to take a look at that and send back comments if they want to. So if you have questions, please feel free. Okay, that doesn't seem to be the case. Thank you.